Greetings! It is turning out to be a beautiful sunny day here in southeastern coastal Carolina on 1 April 7th, 2022, third decade of the 21st century. And I know, second video of the day, what are you going to do, right? I really want to give a shout out to Cosmo Shidan. My apologies if I got that wrong. Thank you for watching the video I did about rebooting Firefly, and thank you for commenting, if for no other reason than providing me with the opportunity to read your comments and respond, but most importantly, the opportunity to nerd out on Firefly and to take a much needed break from socio-political content. So I am greatly appreciative. So without further ado, allow me to get into it. This is Cosmo Shidan responding to my video on whether or not if Disney decides to reboot Firefly, should they, and how should they if they do. And in the response, well, you can't really make Firefly today because the series' backstory is based off of U.S. Civil War and the Reconstruction era, which favored the Confederate States. This, especially as it comes off as a lost cause apologia in space, i.e. it's basically denying that slavery was the cause of the U.S. Civil War. This unfortunately makes Whedon and the Browncoats equal the KKK. Ergo, a reboot would be necessary by jettisoning the backstory and replacing it with a new one. That could be done by replacing the backstory with a corporate war. Well, Cosmo Shidan, thank you so much for responding. And I see where you're going with this, because if you watch any of the special features, if you watch any of the interviews Joss Whedon has done specifically pertaining to Firefly, he took a tremendous amount of inspiration from the U.S. Civil War. Now, in his backstory, while the inspiration came from the U.S. Civil War, because in his own words, everybody loves a loser, I don't know if it was Joss's intent to directly reflect and reference the Confederates and their line of thinking in the 1800s and whatnot, as far as slavery and all that. I totally get the reference, and I totally get where you're coming from, and I totally understand, especially in today's modern era, which is why I said it's the third decade of the 21st century, and we're still talking about topics you think we'd be long done and over with, and we'd be progressing in new areas, but we're not. So yeah, you know, as for rebooting Firefly, I think in some way, shape, or form, depending on how you perceive things, all right? And I'm assuming you're perceiving it as in Joss was directly referencing the U.S. Civil War and all of the things that the Confederacy was, and all and all of that. I will argue, and just for the sake of argument, not that I'm, you know, you're such a bad person and we need to argue, just for the sake of creating argument and discourse, let's assume that Joss was only using it as a reference, but not as a direct source. So in this case, yes, the alliance was the Union, which had more soldiers, it had more men, more equipment, and basically won the war of attrition against the South, or in this case, the Browncoats, the resistance, the rebels, those who wanted to live independently. While I think the backstory allows for enough separation from our own personal civil war, I can definitely see how, based on the interviews and what Joss has said, where he drew inspiration from, I can definitely understand and see the connotation there, the context and the reference. In which case, you know, to the point, I left the question wide open. Should they reboot it? How should they reboot it? You know, for me, and I'll restate my opinion, I think the magic was the characters. I always get called from Durham at this. It's some whatever. I think the magic was the characters. Gina Torres, Nathan Fillion, Alan Tudyk, Ron Glass, God rest his soul, Jewel Staite, Sean Marr, Summer Glau, Adam Baldwin, even Mark Shepard, and a handful of others. I think whether it was the timing, whether it was the people, I think it was appropriate. For me personally, I would much rather see them bring back the original cast and literally set it, sometime later. I don't know if you looked at the comic books, if you've entertained the comic books. So in all fairness, I have the Unification War series. I haven't read it. I have the new Sheriff in the Verse. Haven't read it. I have the new Blue Sun Rising. I have the Sting. And I have I'm a Leaf on the Wind. I haven't read those. So the original Dark Horse released comics I have. The new Greg Pak Boom comic storylines I haven't read yet. I have them, and regrettably it's been more like a collection than it has been like a reading. So I'm not familiar with the canon as far as whether Joss has approved it and if it picks up. There's also a new graphic novel that basically is a completely different story. It's a completely different crew. I don't know if it was intended to potentially spawn a reboot. I don't have that book yet, and I also haven't read it. That being said, in my personal opinion, whatever canon is considered canon. So for my money, it's the comic books that picked up after the series ended by Dark Horse. I think that's where the storyline would have to pick up for, in my opinion, where Zoe had a daughter with Wash, and the remainder of the crew is the remainder of the crew. River is more lucid. She's more in control of her mind. But I think for my money, I'd have to pick it back up with the original characters in a more time-appropriate setting. Whether certain people have aged a little bit on their face, make it more age-appropriate. Pick up the storyline 20 years later, because it's been damn near 20 years. Flipping back to you, Cosmo Shadan, I get the reference. I do. And I understand where you're coming from in the perspective of, in today's modern era, some people may take exception to the fact that Joss was referencing the Civil War, and he was inspired by the Civil War to create the Alliance and the Browncoats, and the Browncoats were essentially the Confederates who eventually went from being the Confederates to the KKK. Interesting note, not that this is meant to be socio-politically motivated, but people tend to forget that the Democratic Party was the original political party of the Confederate South that succeeded from the Union, that was in favor of slavery, more specifically in favor of African slavery. Slavery was not a concept that the American colonies created. All right, slavery was not a concept that the American colonies invented. If anything else, the American colonies segued from just random slavery, random indentured servitude, to migrating towards strictly African slavery, African servitude, using the differences in skin color, the differences in language, the differences in culture as a basis for justifying their actions, to include religion. So I totally understand where, from some of the more negative perspectives of our own history, how that could be a turnoff. But then, for argument's sake, while it may have been the source of inspiration, I don't know that Joss wore that heavily on his sleeve. I don't know that he wore it close to the chest, that he wanted to mimic as much as possible the Confederacy and the Union between the Alliance and the Browncoats. From what I remember, he was basically stating that at that point in time, he was under the impression that everybody loved the underdog, everybody loved the loser, so he created a loser in the rebels. But it's a very interesting take, and one that I'm terribly happy to expand upon, if for no other reason than I don't have to expand upon other issues, and I can totally get meta and nerd the fuck out on all things Firefly. But as I said, for my money, and I don't know about anybody else, I don't know how interested I would be in a reboot if it was a completely different ship, because Firefly and the movie Serenity, basically the title and the name and everything was based on the spaceship. So bringing a different spaceship into the mix would therefore have to change the name of the reboot, in which case it would be something else inspired by Firefly and Serenity. So you'd have to give it a different name, and then in like the subtitles, you'd have to say that this is inspired by the Firefly series and Serenity movie. So in which case, on a different side of that coin, although coins only have two sides, so in a different direction, if you're suggesting that they change up the backstory a little bit and don't directly reference the Union and Confederacy in the American Civil War as a source of inspiration, maybe if they change the backstory as far as, like you were saying, the corporate war or something else where people literally had to choose sides, I agree with that. If you're also suggesting bringing in different actors to portray the same people, but the backstory's different, I don't know if it could work. I don't know if some of us are overly attached to, as I said, Nathan, Gina, Alan, Adam, Jewel, Sean, Summer. I don't know if we're overly attached. And truthfully, I'm going to take just a couple minutes to give a different example. So Jared Padalecki from Supernatural, basically, in order to guarantee himself a paycheck as a working actor, at the end of at the end of Supernatural, he got Walker in production. Now, Walker goes back to a series from the late 80s, early 90s, containing Chuck Norris, in which case, basically, if it's going to have Chuck Norris, it's going to have hand-to-hand combatives, karate, whatever. So Chuck was always, Chuck's version of Walker was always going to have to hoo-ah. So in my personal opinion, there's a tremendous aura surrounding the namesake of Walker, Texas Ranger, as far as how Chuck Norris created the character, portrayed the character. So for my money, I was looking forward to Jared potentially doing his own take on it. Maybe not necessarily like Chuck Norris, but maybe doing his own hand-to-hand combative things, and potentially in his backstory, having a history of hand-to-hand combatives, regardless of whether he legitimately does or not. I mean, he's an actor, he can get trained, so on and so forth. And that's not the direction they went with it. They literally took an existing concept, the previous Walker Texas Ranger, and they completely flipped it and went in a completely different direction. I'm watching it basically out of loyalty for Jared Padalecki. I hate to say it in such terms, but I'm basically watching it out of loyalty for Jared. Only recently in this second season has the storytelling improved. The first season was a bit rough. It felt like they were trying to force certain plot lines. They were trying to force certain emotions, certain just whatever. It just, on top of which, if you're like, okay, I want to see your version of Walker, and you're expecting something similar, it's not. So when I use that example, I don't know if I could necessarily approve of, enjoy, or stomach a completely different Firefly with a different ship in appearance, but a Firefly class ship just reinvented, a new Mal played by somebody else, a new Zoe, a new Wash, a new Shepard, a new Jane, a new Kaylee, a new... Oh, and Morena Baccarin. How can I forget Morena Baccarin? A new Inara, you know, a new Simon in a River. I'm not saying it couldn't work. I just don't know. If you completely change the ship, same name, but different ship, slightly modify the backstory, and I'll say this much, whether we agree or disagree, when I tune in for entertainment purposes, I'm attempting to tune out the real world. So I'm not a massive fan of shows that are attempting to address socio-political concepts. All right? I understand they may be important to some people, but I think when you're trying to reach a broad audience, you have to keep in mind you're trying to make it for an audience of everyone, not an audience of one or two. And for me, I've actually stopped watching certain shows. It's gotten to the point where my wife and I are rewatching older content before the social justice movement, the woke movement, and everything was just so overly done. Like, hey, you thought you were done with CNN and Fox News? Surprise, we're going to put it in your entertainment content as well. We're going to overly address it here in our own personal way that you may or may not approve of, and it's going to completely destroy the entertainment value. At least that's how I took it. So that'd be another concern of mine, is with all the recent fanfare or lack thereof that Disney's been getting over attempting to address all the social justice woke concepts, if a new Firefly reboot was just saturated in modern day social justice wokeness, I don't know how many people it would turn off. I really don't. I don't know how many people would tune in. I don't. For me, I'd probably check it out, you know, at least the first episode or two, but if it was just trying to shove the same stuff down my throat, I'd probably tune out. But hey, I've been rambling for a little over 17 minutes. Anybody else watching this? Let me know what you think. At least Cosmo Shadan got involved and told me what he thought. Or she, I'm sorry. There was no real sense of masculine or feminine. My apologies there. But let me know what you think. Anybody who watches this, let me know what you think. Get involved. You know, let me know if yes, absolutely, we need to have more socio-political content in our entertainment. Or, yes, reboot Firefly, who cares? Change the ship, change the actors. Whatever. By all means, I am more than happy to nerd out on subjects like Firefly. And stay tuned, I'm probably going to post one more video about Smallville. You're awesome.